Okay, thank you everyone for coming. My name is Mani Hamidi, and I'm going to be presenting this work that is in collaboration with Anna Levina's lab, namely Sina, Manos, and Tim, along with my supervisor, Charlie Vu at the University of Tübingen. I'm just going to be showing a simple experiment demonstrating the performance benefits of growing a modular recurrent neural network alongside in lockstep with a curriculum. Now, so So, why modular growth? Modularity is all over the place. It's super pervasive in biology, and all the way from single cells, the organelles inside, to the internal structure of organs, and all the way across organisms over evolutionary timescales. And there are many different reasons, justifications for why modularity is so pervasive. And amongst them is the functional benefits of the fitness benefits of specialization and the division of labor across multiple specialized subunits that you can then compose or recombine in order to yield novel function. And second is the cost benefits. In the case of the brain, for example, you have this cost of wiring that imposes this constraint, this selective pressure to reduce connectivity across more densely connected regions, which is practically the definition of modularity. And last but not least, over evolutionary timescales, you could argue that this modular sort of motifs is almost a side effect of the processes of evolution. For example, gene duplication during development or in developmental processes that yields the wholesale replication of body parts, for example. Now, our focus is on neural networks, and so perhaps this demonstration with brain organ is most apt, but specifically, as you know, the growth of neural networks is not a novel idea, but what we are focusing here specifically is the modular growth mechanism, and doing so in lockstep with a learning curriculum. And the task that we're focusing on is a memory task, and to which a RNN, a recurrent neural network, is best suited. And essentially, it's the simplest possible memory task you can think of. You have the agent making observation of the current state of the environment. In our case, very simple single-dimensional binary stimulus, and it essentially is exposed to a series of these over time and has to encode some memory of these stimuli such that it can perform a task, which in our case is a very simple summation, a mod2 summation, or which is equivalent to an XOR, but nonetheless a simple summation. And so what's important to point out here is that there is a direct correspondence between the timescales of activity of these neural activation patterns, which you can basically get by looking at the autocorrelations of these activities and looking at their spectra. There's direct correspondence between these and the complexity or the difficulty of the task, which here corresponds to the memory span over which they remembered the stimuli. And of course, this is motivated or inspired by actual analysis of this sort that is done on actual brains, where there is a very well-established result where we see that there is this modular clustering of various timescales over different regions of the cortex, which so happens to have a very direct correlation from over the hierarchy in over the cortical hierarchy, essentially, from with shorter timescales corresponding to more sensory regions of the cortex and more complex, arguably longer time scales corresponding to more complex, arguably, activity in the prefrontal regions. Now, we build on past work by my co-authors, Sina, Roxana, Manos, Tim, and their advisors, which they recently presented at iClair, where they essentially showed that you can really increase the memory capacity of these RNNs by subjecting them to curriculum learning. So instead of just jumping in and getting them to learn a task of n equals 10, for example, you first get them to learn a super simple one, the simplest possible task, which is n equals 2. And then only once it has learned to perform that task to satisfaction, do you proceed to expose it to an n equals 3 task. And again, only once it has solved n equals 3 and continues to solve n equals 2 appropriately, then do you proceed to n equals 4, and so on and so forth. And what they found was that you, again, get to learn really much higher you get to basically develop solve much harder tasks, right? 100 as opposed to 30. And this is reflected by the effective timescales that I alluded to earlier of the internal activity of these neurons. Now, the way we build on this is to simply yoke this curriculum learning protocol with this modular growth of the network. So instead of starting with this massive 500 plus neuron recurrent network, we start with a super small one from 5 to 20 neurons large, and we get it to learn the n equals 2 task. And then as once it's solved, we move on to n equals 3, but also grow the network, right? So we add this additional module with limited connectivity between the previous module and the new module, one directional, very hierarchical. And again, as before, wait until it solves n equals 3 and continues to solve n equals 2, and before we proceed. More formally, the relationship, the update equation for these neurons between non-modular and modular are essentially the same. So you have the activity in the current time point dependent on the past activity of a neuron itself and the activity of other neurons in the current time step. And this timescale parameter is what trades off the dependence on sort of the self-memory and the memory as embedded in the activity of the peripheral neurons. And the only difference between the modular and non-modular is simply how this term is defined, that dependence on the activity of other neurons, where in the modular case, you have that relationship divided into the recurrent connections, which is within module connections, and the feed-forward connections. Now, just to go through some of the results, basically comparing the modular and the non-modular topologies or architectures, we see that, first of all, the modular networks have a larger memory capacity that scales linearly with the growth of the network. So it keeps up, right? It doesn't saturate like the non-modular networks do. This is basically a training time, and this is the average complexity of the task solved. And they do so by using far fewer parameters, right? So this was one of the motivations that I mentioned is the cost of wiring, essentially, right? Which in more, I guess, statistical context, you can think of as sort of the complexity of your model along a bias variance kind of trade-off. And these modular networks are getting to solve the task with much less expenditure, so to speak, on parameters. And furthermore, what we do is to test the generalizability of these models across different basically for 2 new tasks, right? So we train these models to say n equals 4 as shown here. And then what we do is we basically freeze the weights and we ask, okay, how well can it solve the n plus k task, which is shown here. And again, we see that there is this slight benefit to having this modular architecture, and that can generalize slightly better to these out-of-distribution tasks. We then test their robustness to perturbations. So there are two kinds of parameters, trained parameters in these networks. One are the weights, which in the modular case have, they break into the feed-forward and the recurrent weights, as I mentioned, but also those timescale parameters that I mentioned, that there is one for every neuron. And so for the weights, we do see again that the modular architecture is more robust. Right, so it takes more larger perturbations to really to see this drop in the performance of the networks. However, with the timescale parameters, the modular networks are actually more sensitive. And so this was surprising to us. We had no idea. We didn't expect this. Looking at the timescales over the course of training, the train timescales that I showed, we actually see a surprising difference, which is that with the modular networks, they actually maintain a higher than 1 level of activity. And 1 is a critical value because a timescale parameter of 1 basically corresponds to 0 dependence or 0 memory of past states of the neuron itself. And the more you move away from that, the more you are actually encoding some capacity to remember what your states were in the past. And so this kind of makes sense of the previous results with the perturbations, in that with the non-modular networks, there's essentially nothing to, or at least later on in the training, there isn't any dependence, there isn't any encoding of memory by these timescale parameters, so there's nothing to perturb, right? Whereas there is actually something being useful being encoded, which is being maintained, and so its perturbations do result in a sort of weak spot of the network. But also looking at the effective time scales, so what I mentioned as sort of the results of these autocorrelation analyses, we see that the modular networks are learning much longer timescales, which is consistent with their superior performance and memory performance, right? As I mentioned earlier in the introduction, and which again seems to be scaling pretty steadily with the complexity of the task. Now, we sort of wanted to gain some more understanding, deeper understanding of how these modular architectures are actually gaining such an advantage. And we started by looking at the distinction between how these feed-forward weights and the recurrent weights are actually, their importance, essentially. And we do so again via perturbation analysis, and we see that the feed-forward weights are way more sensitive to the same amount of perturbation. That is, with the same amount of perturbation, you get a much more massive hit to your performance than if you made the same amount of perturbations to the recurrent weights. This was interesting. We didn't really know what to make of this. But the first analysis we did to sort of dig a little bit deeper into this was to look at just how much each of these weights, the trained value of these weights, change from one module to the next. So we wanted to get an assessment of just how much the backprop signal is essentially making an impact on these like molding these weight values. And what we see is that there is a marked difference between the feed-forward weights and the recurrent weights. There's much more variability. It seems like the feed-forward weights are much more sensitive to the backprop signal. That they're much more critical in determining the reduction of error, essentially, right? How are we doing on time? 5 minutes. Okay, great. Okay, great. Okay, so maybe I'll skip this last part then. If there are questions, I can address them. But one interesting thing that may be of interest to this audience here is that in line with the results I just showed, freezing of the recurrent weights actually turns out to not damage the performance much, especially once you increase the size of the modules to be more than 5. It's essentially the same as if you continue training, which makes us think that this is actually kind of acting like a hierarchical reservoir, which is an interesting observation that we were planning on pursuing in the future. So just in summary, we have this modular growth protocol in lockstep with a curriculum learning strategy that seems to improve learning performance in these recurrent networks all across the board. More complex, they can solve more complex tasks. They can they use fewer parameters. They seem to generalize better and are more robust to perturbations, except for that tau parameters. And again, the recurrent units, the recurrent weights are really reusable, right? So we can almost use these as a reservoir, it seems, which is a direction we would like to further explore. And but before that, we are really interested. We adopted this rather ad hoc growth mechanism, right, which is very hierarchical, very rigid. But we'd like to actually explore these strategies to get the network itself, or perhaps a sort of parent network to guide the growth, autonomous growth of the network itself, and lean a little bit more into some of the original inspirations, particularly with gene duplication and its role in biology to facilitate neofunctionalization or via relaxed selection. And finally, to embed this into more complex models that not just have memory looking in the past, but also do prediction of the sequence in the future. And this would be most relevant in an RL kind of setup. So with that, thank you and my collaborators. Please, if you have any questions.